Everyone, it's lovely to have you and to have this session today. It's Tuesday, March 8th, 10 a.m. PST, 1 p.m. EST, and 8 p.m. where I am, Israel time. And happy March. It's Adar 2nd and Purim Eve is on Wednesday, March 16th. Today we have two speakers, Rachel Kadish in conversation with Julie Lindahl, live from Newton, Massachusetts, talking about legacy and responsibility, a granddaughter's search for her family's forbidden Nazi past. And this session is dedicated to Francine and Colleen Wenard, longtime CSP supporters from Orange County. This is CSP online program 402. You can see a list of our upcoming programs in this 1-month series, as well as what's coming up in the coming week at our website, www.occsp.net, and some highlights. Tomorrow, March 9 at 10 a.m. PST, David N. Myers and Naomi M. Stolzenberg, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryat Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. The program for March 10th with Yair Nitzani is being postponed. Sadly, his father passed away a couple of days ago, so we're postponing that program. And on Sunday, March 13th at noon PST, we have a live from Salon Ben Dosa, our third one. Join us to enjoy a live music performance from Jaffa Pre-Purim musical celebration produced by Asaf Rabi and featuring some amazing Israeli folk musicians, including Aviel Sultan, Julie wow, I'm going to try and say her family name, Benson Divlov, and Amitai Aricha. Just before I introduce our speakers for today and they'll take it from there, I will say that the chat today is closed. It's open. You can send me questions. I'll be collecting them. And as we open for Q&A at the end of the session, I'll bring up all the questions you sent me. And now, to the important part of introducing our speakers for today. So we have Rachel Kadish, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, an award-winning author of 3 novels, including From a Sealed Room, Tolstoy Lied, A Love Story, and The Weight of Ink. She has been a fiction fellow of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Massachusetts Cultural Council, has received the National Jewish Book Award, the Association of Jewish Libraries Fiction Award, and the John Gardner Fiction Award, and was the Koret Writer-in-Residence at Stanford University. Rachel will be in conversation with Julie Lindahl, a multinational author, activist, and educator living in Sweden and visiting the US now, so we get them both together. Her 2018 memoir, The Pendulum, a granddaughter's search for her family's forbidden Nazi past, reveals her 6-year journey through Europe and Latin America to discover the role her grandparents played in the Third Reich, was complicit in the murder of the local population on the large estates he oversaw in occupied Poland. The pendulum used by Julie's grandmother to divine good from bad and true from false becomes a symbol for the elusiveness of truth and morality, but also for the false securities we cling to when we become unmoored. Together, both Rachel and Julie, with other critical acclaimed authors from the Boston area, Rachel and Julie curate a podcast series for exploring how we co-create a world that's more considerate, more resilient, and stronger in the face of today's challenges. I'll drop the link to the website in the chat, and we'll also send it in the following email after this session. So, I'm sure you're as excited as I am to hear Rachel and Julie in conversation, and I'll give it on to you.
Sherelle, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm really delighted to see so many people here. 107 people. Okay, wow. Julie and I are doing what should be the easiest thing in the world, which is being in the same space. But of course, in the world of Zoom, it has a few technical complications. So we're sharing a microphone. So I just want to say before we get started that if we forget to lean into the microphone or pass it between us or something like that, and if you have trouble hearing us, Sherelle, just signal us, let us know, speak up, and we'll adjust accordingly. But it's a real treat to actually be in the same place at the same time. Julie's visiting from Sweden. So I just want to kick us off by saying something about how I got to meet Julie. Some of you may know the work of novelist Derek Miller, and Derek and I share an editor. And at one point he said to me, there's someone you really have to meet. And Derek knows that I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors from Krakow. And he knows that I'm interested not just in memory, but in these questions about how do we move forward, questions of, repair, if that's even the right word. I'm not sure it is, but what does a reparation claim actually repair? What does a restitution claim actually restore? Do we or don't we even try to talk about justice? What kind of dialogues can we have to sort of move forward? And what are the effects of shame and guilt on the perpetrator side, and how do you sort of get a setup that allows us to move forward so that never again really is never again. And so Derek said, listen, there's someone you need to meet. You need to meet Julie Lindahl. She's doing work that's really going to interest you. And so I learned a bit about the work that Julie was doing. And of course, I was really enormously impressed. And then I read The Pendulum. We'll speak a bunch about that, and hopefully I'll be able to get Julie to read us a piece from it, because I think it's such a powerfully written story about discovering complicity within her own family, and all the steps of engaging with that, and then figuring out what you do with that. And then Julie and I met, and I think the real surprise and gift here for me is that I knew we would have a lot in common, but I didn't know that we would become such good friends. And so that's been a real honor and delight. And I will say that the conversation that we have together about the world and life and love and moving forward and all of this is one of the most important conversations in my life. So I'm really delighted to be able to share this conversation. So I guess without further ado, I want to just kick off by asking, for those who have not read The Pendulum, if you would say a little bit about how you grew up and when you realized your family was different.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say where it all began. When something like this, past as heavy as this is in your family, it's probably there from even before you were born. And you know, I on the cover of The Pendulum, don't know if you'll see it. You won't see it here anyway. There's an image of a little girl who's 2 years old, wearing a German traditional dress called a dirndl. And my mother used to put me into this outfit whenever my grandparents, who were living in the interior of Brazil, came to visit. And as an adult, I've reflected on that. You could say it's benign. It's a pretty little dress. But actually, when I think about it, I realized what she was trying to do was to impress her parents, and also to, in a way, signal to them that she hadn't left their way. She hadn't left their path of commitment to the idea of Germany. And as I was growing up, so you could say I was kind of clothed in the past from the very beginning, without much choice in the matter. And as I was growing up, I noticed that my mother could be quite irate about things that I didn't understand, that were never explained, that could not be named. And as I became educated and started to put the pieces together, myself born in Brazil in 1967, my mother born in occupied Poland in 1941, knowing that my grandparents had been in occupied Poland throughout the duration of World War II, I started to want to ask some questions. But my mother was so angry that there was no way I could broach the matter with her. And at some point in my early 20s, I asked my American father, who then told me that I was forbidden from asking any further questions about the matter. So I dropped my studies, which were along those lines, and decided I would never broach the subject again. Just to add in one further point, I became quite close to my German grandmother because I suppose it was a way of trying to get the affection that I didn't feel that I got from my mother. And she was an affectionate person toward me. And but I was also the only grandchild at that point, I think, who could actually converse with her fluently in German, because I made a point of learning German. And there were awkward moments that came up in which her old ideology would simply show itself. And I think you'll hear later on an excerpt from the book about what it was like to be confronted by those moments.
Thanks, Julie. Can you say a little bit more about the process of starting to learn about your grandfather and researching? Did you know him? Was he when you were a child?
Yes. Well, know him is probably stretching it. I mean, we left Brazil when I was 4, or just about turning 4, and he was somebody who was allowed to be in my photo album, but whom I wasn't really allowed to ask questions about. So really, I didn't know him in that sense. I met him on the few occasions he came in from the interior. He amassed a lot of land in the interior of Brazil, and which is another story that I researched. Why did he go there, and how did he amass all that? Mm-hmm.
And how did you start learning more about what he'd done during the war?
Well, in about 2009, the problems that the failure to discuss such a story in the family started to really bear down on my old family, and really started to asphyxiate my most important relationships, those to my mother and my father. And my father was a sort of bulwark against discussing this topic. But after his passing, things really got so bad that I decided, I got into a very deep depression. And my husband asked me what I needed, psychological help, what did I need? And I said, no, I have to go to the German Federal Archives, the Bundesarchiv. And you have to ask yourself how I knew that. But there were enough little shards that I knew about. So I went there and was handed 100 pages about, in fact, both of my grandparents. And this was quite an event, because the Nazis, as you probably all know, were very good at destroying their own documentation. So to, in fact, find anything on one's grandparents in that archive was unlikely. So from those first 100 pages, I learned that my grandfather joined the Nazi Party in 1931, before the takeover of power, so was ideologically convinced, and that he joined the SS in June 1934, the Mounted SS. And I also learned from his party card, where all the locations he'd been in during the war were noted, that he had worked on, I didn't find out that he worked on estates, but I found that he had been stationed in various parts of occupied Poland during the war, and also learned that I knew from my grandmother that the entire family had been stationed there with him. And as time went on, and it wasn't clear to me that I should actually continue to pursue this. In fact, after I received these first documents, I thought, should I or shouldn't I? But there were various people, strangers, who presented themselves and said, look, you really can't just leave it here. So I was very lucky, really, that these strangers arrived and helped me out. So as I gathered more and more documentation together, I learned that sorry.
I don't know if you can hear the dog.
I learned that my grandfather had been somebody who worked for a part of the SS that was responsible for transforming West Central Poland into the breadbasket of the Third Reich. So he was involved in agriculture, but that didn't mean he was just, it sounds benign. His other principal task was, of course, to wage a racial war. And he was what I found out as I began to travel was that, in fact, he was involved in the torture, deportation, and not directly himself, but by association, murder of some of the Polish landowners.
I think one of the most powerful moments in the book is, it's a series of confrontations with your grandmother. First, sort of near confrontations, and then more confrontation. And I think because, I had to stop and think, how would I react if I realized that someone I loved, who had been good to me, was complicit in something? And I just wonder if you would read us that one of the passages with your grandmother.
Sure. So my grandmother lived until she was the age of 103. This is a conversation we had when I was in my early 20s and she was in her probably late 70s, early 80s. And she said a lot of things that really did make me wonder. And so as I start this reading, you should realize that she said something that I really wanted to get away from. It was something that didn't make sense or that was difficult that I wanted to get away from. I tried to change the subject. I have some great new friends at university, I said, attempting to shift the discussion. Oh ho, now that's very nice. A dashing young man, perhaps? Lifting her head, she set the toothpick aside in the pink glass ashtray on the side table to her right. I lied and shook my head. There was someone, but I didn't want to say anything about it in order to avoid returning to the embarrassing subject of my fertility. My efforts to create a diversion had rapidly come to a dead end, and Oma was free to continue with her catharsis, which now took a disturbing turn. And what do they say about that business with the Jews at your university? I'm sure they tell you all sorts of lies. Let me tell you straight from someone who was there that nothing like this ever happened. It was all a lie by the media so that we Germans would feel that we had to keep our heads down. She bowed her head in submission, eyes and voice lowered, as both hands surrendered, palms down on the table. After a moment's silence, she shifted her head and tapped the table disdainfully. Germans were responsible for everything bad, but no one ever talks about the good that we did, and doesn't everyone seem to want to come and live here? Her eyelids suddenly began to flicker uncontrollably behind the shaded spectacles, and she leaned back on the headrest of her armchair. Oh, my eyes. I've tried everything, inoculations from the doctor and all manner of treatments, but nothing helps. It's an illness of the nerves, you understand, to do with everything we've been through. It was all too much. She raised her head slightly and shook her finger. But the Holocaust, I can assure you, did not happen. Each of those last three words was said slowly and deliberately. On previous occasions, when Oma had defended the Third Reich, I let her utterances pass as momentary lapses of temper and signs of aging. Perhaps then I would never have to see them again, which meant that I could avoid being faced with the prospect that there was another side of my grandmother that didn't at all match the gentle person I loved.
Thanks for sharing that. And then there were later conversations with her, right?
Where I confronted her. Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about the process of piecing together the story? Because you went to Poland, you spoke to people, right?
Yes. So when I got to the Institute of National Remembrance in Poznan, I was handed more documentation about my grandfather with his picture on the front, but I couldn't read any of the testimonies in there. There were testimonies from 1946 from Poles who had been tortured and oppressed and hurt by him. And so the young archivist who was tasked with giving me these documents could see I was very distressed, invited me into a back room for a cup of tea, and very quickly agreed to accompany me out into the Polish countryside. the purpose of this was to try to track down some of the families that were named in these documents. Now, I never expected that we would find anyone because it's such a long time ago. And of course, also through communism, people were scattered to the four winds and so on. But in fact, we caught up, all due to the diligence of my friend Robert. We caught up with 5 different families. And I would say that although documentation is extremely important, and of course, without it, I would never have found these people, it really was the meetings with these eyewitnesses and survivors that made something happen within me, and that helped to shift the shame that I felt and the guilt that I was beginning to feel as I traveled around the countryside into something else, something perhaps more useful in the long term. And there was one meeting in particular that I wanted to mention. Should I mention it now? Mm-hmm. Well, some people didn't want to speak with me or shake my hand. Others were, transported back into that time. And I kind of wondered whether this was such a good idea to resurrect all these dreadful memories for these elderly people. But there was one gentleman who talked to me for several hours and was very precise about his story. And it was a terrible story. And I could even see evidence of my grandfather's brutality on his face because he had a scar over one of his eyes from when my grandfather had beaten him over the head because he'd forgotten to doff his cap when he was a young boy, and my grandfather had passed by him. And at the end of this long session together, we stood up, and I felt so bad that I wanted to fall to my knees and beg his forgiveness. And he actually held my hands, held my arms, my forearms, held me up, and kind of shook me around and looked me straight in the eye and said, "It wasn't your fault. And what I really want you to do is to come with me out into my garden and appreciate all the beauty that there is in the world. Can we do that together?" And we did. We stood there and we looked in his garden, actually with his wife as well. And as we did that, something in me started to move. And I realized in that moment that what that man had done with that simple act of generosity was to allow shame and guilt to transform into a feeling of responsibility, that I had a responsibility to pursue this story as far as I could. And to share it with other people and to work with this. I don't know if it resulted in anything for him. I'll never know that, but I hope so.
You speak about shame and guilt, and I think, I've always thought, well, what should people whose families were on the perpetrator side in these situations do? Well, they should learn these stories. They should face up to it. They should all of this, but very few people are willing to step into the shame, the guilt, all of that. And so when you talk about transforming it into a sense of responsibility, can you say something about where that has taken you, where that sort of set your trajectory really from that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know what opportunities I would have to do that, but I think they confronted me fairly quickly in all the political and social crises we've been experiencing. And I remember, it wasn't at all self-evident to me that I should publish this book that I had written. It's a very big step to do that, especially when much of your family opposes you. But in 2014, I was invited to co-host a conference in Stockholm during election week. And at that time, a far-right party in parliament, which had neo-Nazi roots, was about to take about a quarter of the vote, which to me was incomprehensible. How could this be? So I started off the conference, which I had been invited to co-host, by asking those gathered there, they were journalists, historians, philosophers, and also the title of the conference was "Is Fascism on its Way Back in Europe?" I started off by asking them why they were there. It was election week. These were people who were supposed to be on the television, on the radio. And their reply was, because we think this is the only important question of this election. And there and then I realized that this story did not really belong to me anymore. It belonged to history, and it belonged to the world. It belonged to our repository of common humanity. Since then, I've had the pleasure of, this led me into working with Holocaust survivors, many of them in Sweden. Some of them are very well-known activists, or were. Sadly, some of them passed away now. So I actually have worked hands-on in areas of Sweden that have been threatened by neo-Nazis, where people have felt that they had to move out because they felt threatened, and sort of gone into those places and with Holocaust survivors tried to turn the situation around, which has been successful, in fact. So that's very rewarding. And I've had the pleasure of working with Rachel, descendants of Holocaust survivors, and we can conduct conversations very often in which we find that we have quite a lot in common as a result of our family histories. Which is the big surprise, isn't it?
Yeah. A sense of, in very, very different ways, but history haunting everything, and sort of this constant awareness of seeing today through the lens of then, and all of that. I wonder, do you want to say something about when you started to come out with this story? Were there members of your family who embraced it? Were there, obviously there were members of the family who the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, it's very mixed, and to some extent, it's there is a difference between the generations. You can say that in my generation, what I in fact found, because I actually discovered cousins in Paraguay I didn't even know existed during this journey, and we had never met one another, and yet we recognized one another's problems with our parents immediately, that we were unable to communicate with our parents. We'd experienced a lot of anger from our parents that we simply could not explain, could not understand. For them, for us, for our generation, it was very important to know these things, because it meant that some of my cousins have been able to open up discussions with their parents that can, in the end, save their relationships or improve their relationships. And that's really important. This kind of healing in families is very important, because it contributes to peace in the world. And in my case, unfortunately, it didn't contribute to a healing in my own relationship with my parents. But I think what it did for my sister and me was that we were able to understand that all the shame we felt was really an inherited guilt that didn't belong to us. It wasn't ours. And it helped us to move forward in life. Then if we speak about the generation that came before mine, my mother's generation, so she had 4 siblings, it's very mixed. Some reject my book as fiction. They've just said it's outright fiction, has no bearing on the truth, despite the fact that I have 8 folders full of documentation, primary documentation. And there are others who, feel that it's, a bit too strong. It wasn't all that bad and that kind of thing. And, this is all part of a psychology which their generation adopted. And actually, I would say that the number of people in their generation who have been able to step forward and say, no, what my parents did was wrong, and I choose to speak about it, are few. There are relatively few who have been able to take that on.
Yeah.
I
mean, I think all the time about the costs of, constantly sort of standing close to that flame. And certainly even for survivors and children of survivors and grandchildren and people who've devoted themselves to memory, I think all the time of the image of the burning bush, a bush that's not consumed, right? It burns and it burns, but somehow it's not consumed. But of course, that's human beings are not burning bushes. We're consumed.
Yeah.
And every person I know who has devoted their lives, their livelihoods, their lives to preserving memory, certainly on the Jewish side, I know, has had to struggle with this point of how do you preserve yourself? How do you take care of yourself when there is never anything you can do that will be enough to pay tribute to the memory? There is nothing, and certainly you can't repair it. You can't fix it. There is no justice, right? So, but we're trying to do something. We're trying to keep memories alive. We're trying to create a better future. We're trying to make never again mean never again. And it's people get burnt out quickly, right? And then I think about doing that from the side of a perpetrator family where there's this shame and guilt in the mix, and yet you can speak to certain audiences that no one else can. And so I just wonder, what are the things that you do to keep yourself going? And then especially as, and we'll talk more about current events in a moment, but as the temperature in the world gets hotter and hotter in terms of intolerance and all this, you're, I'm sure, deluged with invitations. Which are the ones that you feel like, okay, well, I have to accept this one, because you can't do all of it.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question about burnout, essentially. I think there were dear friends of mine. Actually, the last person I saw before I went to the Bundesarchiv was a Jewish professor, one of my dearest friends, who sadly is no longer alive, who stood at the train station in her village in Germany and stood there clasping one of my other books to her chest and waving at me from the train. And as I headed off to the Bundesarchiv, and she had just finished begging me not to go. Because she said, this is not good for you. She already knew that I was going to run into some horrendous information. She suspected it because she knew my family. And but what I have to say is, yes, there is some truth to what she was saying and to what you're saying, that it's it can easily become too much. But there are various things that have kept me going. One of them is collaborations with people like you, who are willing and, in fact, in welcome conversations, outreach, and friendship. And there's a healing in that, and so that's one thing. I think the other thing is that I've come into writing most of the time, and there is both of us are writers, and there is a healing in writing. So when I simply can't say another word about this, I go back to my writing and work on it. And even though what I'm working on today is certainly connected with this topic, the writing helps me to try to understand, and understanding is enlightenment, and that is good. And I would say that the third thing is, when I think of the journey that I was on, the 6-year journey, one way to look at it was that I was quite lonely. I mean, no one in my family supported me, or my sister did, but she couldn't be involved with it. But I kept running into these strangers who, whenever I thought, I simply can't do this anymore, it's too much, my money's running out and I'm emotionally completely depleted, so 2 bank accounts depleted, and these strangers would come into my life and say, look, what you're doing is important, and I believe in it, and I believe that we believe that there is something important to our society about trying at least to catch glimpses of the truth, even if we can never know the whole truth. And that, to me, is an extremely uplifting idea to keep with me. So that's kept me going.
Yeah. And I think it's so essential, because we have so much testimony, and of course you can never have enough testimony, and yet we have so much testimony about the victims, and so few people willing to speak about what goes on in the psychology of perpetrators and in the family of perpetrators. And of course, that's the, never again can't happen without without more understanding of that. You've talked to me about a few different invitations, and I wonder, I just had one in my mind. You said that you're invited to speak with an imam and a rabbi, and I wonder, just you were telling me a little bit about the conditions in these towns in Sweden and what's going on, and I'd been very ignorant about it. So I wonder if maybe you'd say a little bit about that kind of scenario where you're brought in to speak.
Yeah, I mean, in Sweden, you probably know that we took in, as a European country, we took in more people from Middle Eastern wars proportionate to our population in around 2015 than any other country. So, and with that came some imported anti-Semitism, some imported extremism. And even though that we weren't allowed to talk about that for a long time in Sweden without being called a racist, now we can talk about it because it actually is true that there is some of that. That is not to say that everyone who came is like that. In fact, the number is very small, but it doesn't take many extremists to upset. It only takes a very few extremists to upset an entire society. So there's that. And at the same time, Sweden has, in areas, a historical problem with the far right. I mentioned this party. We had a race institute established in Sweden in 1922, which was much admired by the Nazis and became a center in Europe for, so-called racial studies, sort of classifying people into different races. So there is this historical issue, and the far right in Sweden feeds on this. And so the presence of these two forces in various urban centers creates a problem and a tension that has to be addressed. And actually, as I mentioned previously, there are instances of it's not everywhere, so I don't want to create an image of Sweden as a country in crisis. No, it isn't. But I've certainly worked in a pocket of Sweden where people were starting to move out because of threats by a few far-right extremists who were terrorizing their children and things. So I try to, with my colleagues, Holocaust survivors and their descendants, to go into those areas. And Rachel was referring to a project between an imam and a rabbi in the city of Malmö, in which they are trying to have a public dialogue to deal with these tensions and this extremism. And so I've been invited with a colleague to come and join them in the public conversation, which is a great honor and which I really look forward to.
Of course, this conversation is not happening in the abstract. It's happening today, this week, this month, this year. And Julie's currently visiting from Sweden, and we've obviously been talking a lot about Ukraine and about what's been going on. And I wonder if you can say a little bit about what you said, some things that you wish people understood a bit more about the situation, or just a perspective that you have on it that I hadn't thought of.
Yes. Well, I think all of us are aware of Putin's pretext for invasion, which is that Ukraine is a fascist state and is a threat to Russians. And of course, with that, he's harking back to history and old grievances. One thing I started to research while I was on the train coming here was, so what proportion of the Russian population, in fact, has supported Putin over his many years in power? And as it turns out, it's quite a high number, about 79% over very many years. At the invasion of the Crimea, it went up. It didn't go over 79%, but it was high. And so you can ask yourself, why? Is it just because people are afraid? They can't have their own mind in Putin's Russia? I'm not so sure about that. What I think, and this is very much as a result of my own experience, as well as listening to people interviewed in Russia, that they see Putin as a person who provides them security and safety and so on. But my own experience is of that when is of a self-victimization syndrome. I come from a family that actually self-victimized itself. You heard my grandmother in the reading that I did victimizing herself, all that she had been through, all of the difficulties, all of the terrible times and all that, when in fact, she was not the principal victim. At the same time, it cannot be denied that some Germans did suffer, right? German cities were bombed and things like that. We know about that. But, the effect this had on me was that when I was a young person, and I was at university, I wanted to believe this victim story. So I started to feed myself with, there were books about all these German refugees who were thrown out of the East after the Second World War, these, trains of refugees, starving people, and so on. And I really wanted to convince myself that my family were among those. I wanted to believe that we too were victims, and so I've been through that. It takes a lot of work to break free of that self-victimization when you've been fed it all the time and you haven't had any opportunity to work on truth, history, the realities. It takes a lot of work to crack out of that. Now, I have grown up and lived in free societies where it's been possible for me to do that. Russians, on the other hand, and certainly under the Soviet Union, have not been able to process their Second World War past. And therefore, that is, to me, one of the reasons why Putin's appeal to them, why he's using this old grievance about the Second World War, because there's all these unprocessed family stories in which people have been left kind of, they victimize themselves. That, yes, of course, we are the victims. We've always been. And instead of coming to a more balanced perspective of what in fact took place during the Second World War, Russia was, in the Soviet Union, was both a perpetrator and a victim. And you have to, go into the details of that. So it's a reflection on my part that this is not going to go away if Putin goes away. This will be there in the population. And the only way to work with it is to encourage people to face the reality of their family and community past.
I think, when I listen to your story, it's so striking to me how much work is involved in not drinking in grievance, in breaking out of that. And I think you said something yesterday when we were talking, you said people who haven't had a chance to come to terms with their past are going to be easy pickings for a dictator and an extremist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We could go on and on, but I think maybe we're at a point in our conversation where, Sherelle, are there questions that are coming in? Because maybe we should turn to some of those.
Yes. So I'll do two things. I'll start with the questions I have here, and I'll also open up the chat so people can put them directly and you could view them too. I'll start with something that Amy asked here. Given your experiences with denial and hostility, how do you think we can make vivid the truth about Holocaust to younger generations? So if you can talk to that a little.
Yeah, well, I mean, I visit, and when I get back to Sweden, I'm going to travel up to the middle of Sweden and speak to some school children with my friend Helena Truss, who is also the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, about our family stories. And I think it's very, very important to have those combinations, to go to children, to speak to them about our stories, and also not to be, one of the things that I think has been in the past has been missing. If I think of my own, how I learned history, it's very often from dry history books, and where the emotion is left out. And many historians are extremely skeptical of bringing emotion into history because they think it clouds the facts. The realities can be clouded. And I was faced with that many times. But my own feeling is that unless what is human history, except in a way a long progression of reactions and counter reactions, which for the most part are not particularly logical. So I think that those of us who come from families like this need to not be afraid of bringing in our emotions and our feelings about things, including when we speak to school children, because that is the way that school children will be able to start to get interested and start to identify. If I just stood there and rattled off a bunch of dates and facts about what my grandfather did, they wouldn't take a thing in. So I think certainly all the work that's been done on testimony, for example, is absolutely critical, because these are very human stories, and they're of course used widely by schools.
Thank you. So there are many questions coming in, and I'll just start kind of bringing them up. So there's a question here: if your grandmother was still alive when the book was published, and if you can say a few words about that.
If she wasn't alive when it was published, so I don't know if that answers the question.
Probably,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And one moment. With this story and having it coming out, were there people that reached out to you that experienced the same kind of family story? Did you have a chance to meet any people that your story allowed them to start kind of confronting their own?
Yeah, I mean, I had it was interesting that after I started giving talks, there were long lines of people with all kinds of family secrets. And they didn't just have to do with Nazism, but, now you've given me the motivation to start to confront this family secret. But as far as people who had a perpetrator or suspected, for the most part, it's that they suspect, they don't know, because these things are not discussed in their families. And for the most part, families don't know the facts. So there are some people who have approached me, and I have one dear friend who I actually can name because I know that she's working on her own personal story. Is the granddaughter of Otto Wächter. You might know the work of Philippe Sands, who has written about a book called The Rat Line about Otto Wächter, who was a very high-ranking perpetrator. And his granddaughter, Frederica Magdalena, is a very good friend of mine based in Vienna, who is working now. And she and I have spoken quite a bit about the issues. You know, I'm kind of ahead of her and in writing my story. We've talked quite a lot. And I guess it's not that we can do anything much more than reassure one another that we're doing the right thing, because it's not easy to know. It may sound very strange to this audience. I understand that it does, but for us, it's a question of, our families will call us, will say that we have betrayed them, and this is a difficult thing to get your mind around. Are you really betraying your family? No, probably not, because actually the family is probably not very well if they are not able to deal with these things.
Was the last time you were here when we recorded the podcast with you and Jessica Schwartz? Mm-hmm. So Jessica Schwartz, who wrote the novel The Women in the Castle, mm-hmm. Her grandmother, her grandparents were also in the Nazi party. She actually had a New York Times piece called "I Loved My Grandmother, but She Was a Nazi." This was from many years ago, so that's something if people want to look that up. But there's a podcast on the Voices Between website, yes, where the two of you, and we actually recorded that sitting at the table, and I was setting up, and then I got to sort of stand back and listen to the two of you talk to each other. Mm-hmm. And I felt like there was almost this relief that, how few people understand what this process is that you're doing. I was doing a program with Jessica at one point on a live NPR show, and we had, callers, and someone had pulled off to the side of the road and called in when she heard Jessica speaking. And this woman said, And basically, it's, my recollection is she said, I need you to tell me what to do. We have a portrait of my grandfather in his Nazi uniform up in the attic. Nobody wants it. I don't know what to do with it. And sitting there with Jessica at the microphone, letting you take this.
Yeah.
But it was powerful.
Yeah.
And Julie, if we can ask, what's your relationship with your parents today, these days? Is it like...
My father passed away in 2007, but this family situation had taken its toll. I was very close to my father when I was younger, but when you have something like this and you can't talk, it kind of bleeds into everything, and hurts your closest relationships. And sadly, it's hurt my relationship with my mother, so I don't speak with her. But I really do wish her well. And if there's one thing that I would say this work has done, it is to completely get rid of my anger about my anger towards her, because of course I was angry from childhood. She was constantly angry at me, and for reasons I couldn't understand. But my own anger is completely gone, and I think that's extremely important, because when we can work through our anger, even though anger can be a great spur to action, if you hang on to it, it can fester and become something that is really contrary to peace. So, I'm happy that at least I've got to that point, and you never know what's going to happen in the future. So,
So, if we had another hour, another topic would be something I've learned from you, which I didn't know, which is the Nazi ideology about child rearing and the pressures put on women in the Nazi Party about how the specific ways they should raise their children, and then the legacy. So, I think about your mother growing up being raised that way, and then becoming a mother herself. All things I hadn't known.
In some of the questions, there were a few names that were kind of written and asking if you were aware of. So I'll say a couple and see if any of them speak to you. So Sylvia Foti and Jennifer Teague, author of My Grandfather Would Have Killed Me. If you had a chance to be in conversation with...
I haven't spoken with Jennifer Teague, but I'm aware of her story. And of course, it's an extremely important and dramatic one, and very unique. I don't know the other one, so but I'll certainly look it up.
I think I have that book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so Rachel, maybe you can say a few words about that.
If I'm remembering right, isn't she the granddaughter of the commandant at Auschwitz?
I think so.
Story, who is depicted in Schindler's List, as he played by, is it Ralph Fiennes? Is that the actor, that character? But
we're talking about Jennifer Teague.
Oh,
yeah.
All right.
Yes,
sorry. That's what I was.
That's
talking
her.
About.
Did you want us to explain the story? Yeah, you're right. You're right. Carry on.
Oh, just know that's it. But that's who her grandfather was, and then she is biracial, I believe.
Yes.
Right. So just in all the different ways that she would violate her grandfather's worldview.
Yeah.
But I'm not familiar with the other authors, so I'm sorry about that.
Rachel, I was wondering maybe for you if you can say a little bit about this friendship and this kind of intimate historical and contemporary conversation with Julie.
I think, well, as I hope is clear, I have so much, respect and warmth for Julie. And I also won't pretend that it's always easy. I mean, you can sort of in theory say, okay, well, we're individual people and we come from, these families, but it doesn't mean, sometimes we've been invited to an event and it's sort of, we'll have, one person from each side. I mean, Julie and I aren't on different sides. Our grandparents were, and it's not even sides, right? Yeah. It's, it's perpetrator victim. That's not sides. It's something else. Mm-hmm. But there are every now and then these moments of real double take. There was that time we were doing a talk together in Stockholm. And we've done a couple where we have pictures of our grandparents or of our grandmothers projected on the walls behind us when we're speaking. And I can't remember if I said anything to you at the time, but our chairs were set up and we're ready to sit down. And I look behind me over my shoulder, and I see that it's Julie's grandmother behind me, that the chairs had, the images were on the wrong side. And I had this sort of gut level reaction that you sort of, it's sort of just back to those raw feelings of, no, this is what we're talking about. And this is, and just, quickly and I'm moving to the other side of the stage right now. Just a really, I think it's been powerful to recognize that in radically different ways, how powerfully each of our lives have been shaped by the stories from our grandparents, or the stories our grandparents wouldn't tell, and how it impacted our mothers, and and it's sort of it's uncomfortable I'm uncomfortable even saying that, because to put these two things in the same sentence is, I had the same reaction, visceral reaction that I did on the stage. No, wait, this is over here, that's over there, and that's true. And we are also two people who are trying to move forward, and I really do feel like if we can't move past these, if well-intentioned people can't move past these things, and if we make, mistakes in how we're speaking about things, correct each other, move forward, then, what hope is there? I mean, if you believe that there should be muscle in never again, you have to push past those difficult moments.
And I also want to add that we're both mothers.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important. Because if we don't do something and break the chain, it's not like the simple passage of time will take care of these things. We can look at many conflicts that have gone on for hundreds of years and keep rearing their ugly heads because people don't take on the problem. They don't take on the difficulties in their own communities and families. So we are, above all, I would say, mothers. And we want our children to grow up in a peaceful world, which we don't have right now.
Yeah. I'm wondering, for you, Julie, in this situation right now, have you received any threats or harassed by right-wing nationalists, or is it something like that you're facing also from the other side, kind of pushback to what you're doing?
I mean, I've every year on Hitler's birthday, I receive a letter from some anonymous source on my website telling me that I should respect Hitler. He was the greatest leader ever, and so on. And don't I realize that what I'm doing is terrible? And of course, this is supposed to unsettle me and make me feel like my family is threatened. And occasionally on social media, I've people stalk me and try to undermine my story. I don't release the last name of my grandfather mainly because there are people still alive who bear his name, and it makes their lives very complicated. So people try to hound me. The far right tries to hound me about that and undermine the story. But I don't really. I mean, I've had the advantage of working with Holocaust survivors. There was once I was worried about this. I mean, I was worried about, not for myself, I was worried for my husband and children. And I was with a dear friend of mine called Hedi Fried, who is a kind of national icon in Sweden and survived the Holocaust. And she looked at me and she said, well, if you must not be afraid, because the minute you are afraid of these people, they have won. And so it was from her and it was with her that I also went up to the center of Sweden to try to deal with the neo-Nazi problem there. So keeping that in my mind from my dear friend is something that has helped me a lot.
There was a moment that you mentioned that act of generosity that you mentioned helped turn the shame and guilt into responsibility. And I think for both of you, like taking that burden and turning it into something that takes action and responsibility. And I was wondering if, I don't know, if you can speak a little to how to do that. How do you turn this weight into action and responsibility and doing in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone will have their own answer to that, whether that is, and there are a lot of different directions you can take that, and you can take that toward responsibility to combating anti-Semitism. You can take it toward responsibility to, combating genocide. You can take it to, packing food boxes for refugees. You can, and I think we all have, yourself, some people don't have time to give, but they have money to give. Some people have a specific skill they can give. Some people, I'm a storyteller. So of course I focus a lot on, there was a question earlier about how you make stories vivid so that people will feel them, because I'm very aware of the difference between just reading a list of facts versus reading a narrative that gets your heart going, because you care about the people. And if a story is well enough told and your heart is pounding, then your people are responding physically, viscerally, and they'll care in a different way. So I sometimes focus on storytelling, but whatever it is, just to sort of pick what you can do, and to try not to be defeated by the enormity of it, because it takes all of us working on it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would have to add is that I think one lesson we've learned over these years, where the politics of the world have become more authoritarian, more contrary to human rights, much more frightening and brutal than what many of us remember. What came just before that? That one of the biggest dangers is indifference. Taking responsibility to me is not being indifferent. So not watching the news at night and thinking, well, this doesn't really have anything to do with me, and I'm just going to get on with my day. And of course, you can't take on all the woes of the world because it'll crush you. But at the same time, as Rachel is suggesting, there's something everyone can do, whether that's to write their story, or in my world, going into your family and asking difficult questions and confronting old blockages and things is doing that, is taking responsibility, is not being indifferent.
Thank you. Rachel, Julie, thank you so much. It's been inspiring to hear stories and listen to you, especially these days. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you so much for the chance to share this conversation and open it up.
Yes, thank you for having us. And thank you, Rachel.
So glad you're here.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day or evening. We'll obviously send you a follow-up email with the recording of the session, as many of you asked, as well as a lot of the things that came up, the books and links to the websites and podcasts. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.